Ready to go? Yeah. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this evening's meeting of Audit and Governance. It's Wednesday, the 8th of September. And for those of you with a long memory, the last time we met physically, I believe, was March 2020. So this is very strange for all of us. Well, it's strange for me. Without further ado, we have an apology, and it's only a partial apology. Councillor Mason will be slightly late for his arrival. He's still at work. He will be with us, he hopes, for 10 to 6. So it made sense just to make a start, and he can join us as we go along. Can I ask, are there any declarations of interest from members? No. I will ask Councillor Mason, but I suspect not. Agenda item 2, the minutes of the meeting dated the 28th of July 2021. Are there any issues of accuracy? No. I've been contacted separately by actually one of our public speakers this afternoon to state that she's unhappy with the reference that she considered to have been failures to carry out previous similar action plans. And it's the considered element of that. Basically, anybody that speaks as part of public participation offer us an opinion. They're not offering us fact. And so it should be taken as read that it's an opinion as opposed to any evidential basis. Are there any matters arising from the minutes? Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. It is just so that it's the minutes within the minutes. It's getting a bit meta, this. From 2 meetings ago, I did ask about the funding, the cost essentially of the action plan relating to the public interest reports. And I was told, well, it's written here that it was confirmed that funding had not yet been identified. I was wondering if it has now been identified. Thank you.
Thank you. Although we don't have our Chief Finance Officer, we do have our Monitoring Officer. Do you have any update on that, or is that something that we need to follow up with Debbie?
Chair, it is something that we'd need to follow up with Debbie. She's not here this evening because the action plan is technically not on the agenda this evening, but it is coming to the 29th of September's meeting.
Yes.
So I will ensure that she has a full response for that occasion.
Fantastic. Councillor Webb.
Chair, since I've asked this a couple of times now, could we have that recorded as an action point that the funding for the action plan will be disclosed in that meeting?
I think that's appropriate, and I will write to the Section 151 Chief Finance Officer.
Thank you.
To ask that be brought to the next meeting. If there aren't any other matters arising, are you all happy for me to sign those off as an accurate record? And for the first time in, well, 18 months or so, I'm going to be in a position to physically sign a set of minutes off, along with a massive pile of other minutes, but there we go. So, agenda item 3 is public participation. Now, we have potentially 4, but at the moment 3, 2 physical members of the public and 1 person who's definitely joining us by Zoom. So our first public speaker is Gwen Swinburne, and she wishes to speak on constitution and PIR brackets remit of the committee. I'm just going to have to put you on time. Hang on, Gwen.
I'm going to be in time, Chair.
Hold your horses. I need to get the timings. Because normally our Democratic Services Officer would be sat right next to me. Oh, it's all right. All right. Yeah, you tell me when it's 30 seconds. Right.
Oh,
Anytime you like.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry to raise this. We have another basic governance fail, which is playing out horribly in slow motion. This time, the proportionality of at least one committee. The debacle has now resulted in unseemly behaviour by senior Labour councillors in full council, and shockingly, with the chair of corporate scrutiny unlawfully closing his own meeting for secret discussions, then refusing to chair it, marching out with all the Labour members as the monitoring officer was stating her decided position. The abuse of committee protocols, the petulance, rudeness and secrecy is bringing the council into disrepute. I have asked that all advice, concerns and proposed solutions be published, Chair, so we too can see the issues. The council is not a private club. It is also time this committee had oversight of the proportionality rules and processes to ensure they are fit for purpose. Are they addressed in the Constitution properly? May I further ask that at council, whenever proportionality is addressed, the monitoring officer be required to present a full explanation of her methodology, supported as needed with electronic links to legislation and good practice, so this can never happen again. I would ask, as has been the case previously, that all required and optional training offered to and received by members be held on open data and reviewed every year by both Joint Standards and Audit and Governance. Considering the conduct of certain members, it's not immediately apparent they had mandatory training in committee governance, conduct or chair skills. In view of the ongoing volatility of the council, may I further request, Chair, that chair skills be added as mandatory training for all members at the start of each cycle. May I particularly ask that they receive an in-depth briefing on if, when and how they can go into private session. I will be dealing with the officer's silence on these matters elsewhere. Chair, finally, thank you for delaying the constitution item. Ahead of wherever you are reviewing, may I ask if, in order to smooth the process, we may write to you on specific points, as there has been no open consultation, no public meetings or private, we citizens have had little chance to engage. Perhaps that can be corrected. And finally, Chair, can we have an update today on the recruitment of the independent person, please?
Thank you. I can certainly accede to some of those, and please, if you have any comments on the Constitution, by all means, write to myself or the Vice Chair. Yeah, we'd be very, very keen to have them.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
I'll send these round.
Thank you. Our second speaker is Andy Mendes, our erstwhile colleague.
He staggers to the spectrum, whatever it is. Hi.
Whenever you're
hello
ready.
there, first of all, and I'm still here. It's actually nice to see people, isn't it? It's been said before, but I'm ever so disappointed that there's no free tea. I trust you can work on that for the next meeting, assuming I'm still here. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the Constitution, so you won't have to worry about 3 minutes, I don't think. But I did read the settlement paper with some puzzlement. We start in the introduction with, they should only be used in true, this is payments, they should only be used in truly exceptional circumstances. I think I remember seeing that somewhere before. But then we move through the blackmail phase in sort of page 2 of the document, where, for example, to prevent an employee bringing a claim. And then in the call of the paper, where In these cases of mutual termination, there will usually be a settlement agreement reached between the parties, and this may include the making of a special severance payment. Now, by this stage, this is pretty much business as usual with an extra form, isn't it? So that's the general puzzlement. A few specific points, if I may, in detail. I note that there is no mention of school settlements, which have been a significant part of the 34 payments made in the last 5 years. Will these new procedures have any impact on school governing bodies? And should they, I guess, is the other question. I understand there's a distinction, but nevertheless, they all get reported here. Even more odd, nowhere in the procedure, as far as I can find, is the word redundancy mentioned. Now, surely most terminations within the council, at least I hope most terminations within the council, which are not just normal leaving, are redundancies rather than dismissals. It would be depressing if that were not the case. Even as I understand it, the recent cause celeb was classed finally as a redundancy. So I don't understand why redundancy is not clearly defined and described in the paper. And if Trudy's now found it, then I apologize. And as the paper progresses, the detail becomes more problematic for me. For instance, why is paragraph 611 there? Surely that talks about having a budget for special severance payments. Now, we start by saying these are truly exceptional and value for money and all that stuff. By 611, we say we're going to have a budget for SSPs. Now, what on earth is going on if those two things don't seem to me conflict? So overall, I fear that the proposal is one example of the time and money being spent on trying to provide a fig leaf in response to PIR, and that it will have very little effect except to increase bureaucracy, to increase legal fees, and perhaps even create the need for additional senior staff to administer it. So that's my bit, and I look forward to the rest of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mendes. Can I just confirm that the next speaker is on Zoom? Yes, thank you. And our next speaker is Councillor Kilbane, who wishes to speak on the Constitution. Councillor Kilbane, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me, Chair?
Oh, loud and clear.
I'll try and keep.
You have 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll try and keep my voice down a little then. Thank you. Nice to see you all around the table. Shame I can't be there with you. I do want to speak about the Constitution, but firstly, just to echo some of the thoughts of the previous speaker. I think he's given you plenty to mull over in your debate. I would like to draw attention to paragraph 6.17 on page 21 of the guidance on the use of settlements agreements. I guess we're going to be calling this the Councillor Keith Aspden clause, because it makes the clear point that if the complaint has been brought against you, then you should have no part in deciding whether or not payment should be made to that person, and that no payment should be made to avoid unwelcome publicity or embarrassment. Now, you know, it's a shame that we have to go to the lengths of actually writing that down, because it should be clear to absolutely anyone in that position that they would have a conflict of interest. We are the elected representatives of the city. We are not 12-year-old children. And quite frankly, if you didn't see your conflict of interest in that case, then you're not really fit to hold the office. However, I'm glad that it's in there. In terms of the constitutional changes, I was very pleased, Chair, to see that this has been delayed or postponed. What I'm here to ask for is a longer delay or postponement. There are so many things that have not been done properly within this council in my short experience of it. There's too many to list. I'd use up all my time. The Constitution is the fundamental document that governs everything that we do, and it's absolutely critical that we get it right. When it was changed last time, it was done very quickly, and it has since caused us immense problems. So I ask you to pause. There's no reason why this these changes need to be ready by October. We can put it out to wider consultation. We can get citizen participation. If you look at the documents that I know you got the documents late, Chair, which is one of the reasons that it's been delayed, but trying to make head and a tail of those documents is very difficult. There are no real track changes. You can't really see very easily what's changed, let alone any explanation as to why it has changed. So please, 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 this time, let's do this properly. Let's workshop it if we need to, whatever we need to do to make sure we've got a document that's fit for this council in the 21st century. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Kilbane. And I believe that is potentially the last of our speakers. Yes, unfortunately, the final speaker that we did have, we've just been unable to contact. So without further ado, we will move to the agenda proper, and agenda item 4 is the report in the public interest exit strategies. Guidance on the use of settlement agreements, including special severance payments. And we've heard from a number of the public speakers a number of points which I'm sure we will want to raise in our debate. I'm going to hand over initially to Janie Berry, but we do have Trudy Forster here, who's the head of HR. Janie, would you like to introduce this report?
Thank you, Chair. So as members of this committee are acutely aware, the officers are working to fulfil the requirements of the action plan, which was agreed by full council on the 4th of May. This is referencing recommendation 1 and partly recommendation 2 as well. The document here before you this evening is here for consideration by this committee prior to its approval by the Staffing Matters and Urgency Committee, which currently is scheduled to meet on the 20th of September. So I apologise at recommendation 1 where there's the 2 asterisks or stars for the date, but it is potentially going to that committee meeting on the 20th, and the agenda for that committee is published this coming Friday from memory. So it's here for consideration. It's here for consideration of any comments that you have, areas that need to be either more expressly explained. We'll take into account the recommendations and the views from members of the public as well. In order to get to this state, this document has had the benefit of external legal advice. It has also been to internal audit as well, and we have also taken into account the recent publications which have come down from central government and the MHCLG consultation and subsequent guidance around special severance payments for local authorities. Happy to take any questions. However, as you indicate, Trudy's here as the head of HR, who can answer more of the technical issues and relating to HR issues. But Chair, it's here for discussion. Just also note the recommendations which appear in the covering report for consideration by yourselves this evening.
Thank you. Before I go on to talk about the recommendations, Trudy, was there anything that you specifically wanted to raise before we go into debate?
I don't think there's anything specific, Chair. I think it's Janie's covered it all really, and then we can go through any questions and have some detailed discussion.
Lovely, thank you. So I want to open this out to members for questioning of Trudy and Janie. But we do have, at the end of our debate and discussions, some recommendations that you've had outlined to you, and the option is that this committee chooses not to accept the recommendations that we have before us, namely 1, that Staffing Matters and Urgency consider the exit strategy paper, the one that we're debating, that the head of HR liaise with the executive and the corporate management team to ensure consistent compliance with the guidance, and that the head of internal audit will provide an annual report to A&G committee detailing compliance with this guidance and the council's use of special severance payments. And We have our additional colleague, Councillor Mason, who's just joining the meeting. Councillor Mason, we've just had Janie introducing agenda item 4. And I've just gone through the recommendations, but we haven't actually started any debate or questions of officers.
Brilliant,
So,
thank you.
but welcome. Oh, of course. Councillor Mason, do you have any declarations of interest, given that you weren't here at the beginning of the meeting when I did ask for declarations?
Not given that we're not covering the Constitution, no.
No, thank you. So, are there any questions from members? I've got Councillor Lomas, Councillor Webb, Councillor Lomas.
Thank you, Chair. When I was reading this, there's several references all the way through to our chief officer, capitalised. And I think it might be helpful to define somewhere in the guidance what that actually means, because we don't have a chief executive anymore, we have a chief operating officer. Does it refer to the chief operating officer? Are there other people who would fall under that category of being a chief officer, or is it a specific individual job role? I think that would be really helpful. That's my first question.
Yeah. Do you want to answer that, and then you can go into
I think that's a good point. We could include that in the definitions section at paragraph 1. Had we been looking at the Constitution, there is a very clear definition of what constitutes the chief officer for this organisation. Chief officer is assistant director, director, and corporate director, and the chief operating officer here. There's also a statutory definition of a chief officer as well under the Local Government and Housing Act, but we do make it very clear in the proposed constitution for York who is classed as a chief officer, but we can certainly add that in the definitions section, which I think would make the most sense.
Yes.
Chair.
Yep. Great, fantastic. And now I know you have further questions, Councillor Lomas. Do you want to go on? No. Councillor Webb.
Thanks. I'll ask hopefully a relatively simple starting question. The recommendation 1 that Staffing Matters and Urgency Committee adopt this. Could you just clarify, because I don't know huge amounts about Staffing Matters and Urgency. Is that going to be public? Will it be published? And also, who sits on that committee now? Because obviously, given that this has come about due to the public interest report around Councillor Aston's decisions, will that play into effect if he does sit on that committee?
I think it's a valid question. Yes, please.
So Staffing Matters and Urgency Committees does sit on the 20th of September. I knew you were going to ask me about membership, but I'm having a senior moment on people's names this week. So it's Councillor Hook, Councillor de Gaulle, Councillor Kilbane, I think, and thank you, Chair, and Councillor Aston. However, Councillor Aston is not able to attend the meeting on the 20th. I've already received his apologies. So
on that note, will he then be substituted by somebody else?
In accordance with the council's constitution, he's entitled to send a substitute. But as I say, we haven't published the agenda yet, because obviously we're wanting the feedback from Audit and Governance. So the agenda for that committee is actually published on, I'm sure it's Friday. But I've already received his apologies because it's a scheduled meeting in our calendar in any event. But I don't know who the substitute is as yet, because we haven't published the agenda.
Sorry, is there a named substitute then?
It's Councillor Widowson. That's the named substitute, but that I know that we're going to talk about substitutes. After that, that's because Councillor Kilbane also referenced it. It is causing lots of problems at the moment.
Yes.
However, if the named substitute is not available, there's a provision in the current constitution whereby, so long as either myself or the Chief Operating Officer are notified of who that other substitute is, that person will be attending. So it's the named one is currently Councillor Widowson. But again, I don't know if she's
Yeah.
available or not, because to be honest, in my calendar, I've not got that far yet.
Everybody's preempting what
honest.
we're going to be talking about later on in the meeting, but there you go. Were there any other questions? Any supplementaries? No? No. Did I see you indicating, Councillor Lomas? Yes. I thought I had.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I've just got a couple
I didn't see a yellow hand coming up.
Oh, I know. We've got so used to it, haven't we? I'm looking here in the section 6.8 financial considerations, but it's something that features a few times in various places. It talks about legal assessments and legal advice all the way through. This particular one I'm looking at is 6.9, where it says, where relevant, a legal assessment of an organisation's chances of winning or losing an employment tribunal and the potential value of any award that would be made. It doesn't really say whose legal assessment, because many people might offer a legal assessment about the chances of winning a tribunal or the potential costs of a tribunal. And I think it's important to clarify what kind of legal assessment we're talking about. And I think given the circumstances, it would need to be a legal assessment that had some independence from the decision making.
Thank you. Yes, please.
So for the purposes of corporate counsel, the legal assessment is in the name of the chief legal officer in accordance with the Constitution. So there is defined functions of the role of the chief legal officer in the Constitution, which is also around the settling of proceedings or potential proceedings, etc., in terms of value for money. That is the corporate, that is the statutory kind of function, if you like, and I'm the chief solicitor, so technically any legal advice is done in my name. However, in instances like this, there is 99 times out of 100 always independent legal advice received, because these are highly complex. And I think, as I've said in previous meetings, the employment law team element of legal services is not sufficiently specialist to cover these areas of work, in my professional opinion. So it would always be an external legal opinion that the council receives in sort of these sort of circumstances, because I have an employment law team of one, and therefore that person is required to specialise in certain areas, and it would not be in these because they have to specialise in the more day-to-day employment functions for the council. So it is a specialist skill set. It is a very technical area of law as well. So you tend to go to independent legal advisors, and that is a practice that I've operated in previous councils when I've been the chief legal officer as well over the last 8 years or so, and that is the decision that I would make. But in the Constitution, I'm sorry, Chair, to keep coming back to that, but in the Constitution, it is a defined responsibility of the chief legal officer or the chief solicitor for the council.
Thank you, Chair. I think that what you are describing is what we would hope for, but that's not necessarily what is going to be written in, is it? Because it's just going to say a legal assessment, and if that by definition elsewhere in the Constitution is the chief legal officer's legal assessment, then that's not what you're describing. So I think that we need to look at this as if the people in this room are not involved in it. We need to look at it as if I just arrived and I'm trying to use this guidance. How can we be satisfied that what you're describing is always going to happen if it's not actually written down that way?
No, I think that's a good point. Yes, sorry,
Yeah,
please.
Chair, I'm willing to put some additional discussion around it, and in the Constitution as well, there's also additional definition going into the Constitution around Appendix 1. I'm really sorry that we're not supposed to be discussing that this evening, but
we will come to that.
when we eventually get to Appendix 1 in the new Constitution, I've put a lot more emphasis in there around staffing conditions, about who can do what and when and why and circumstances, and so that is currently being reviewed as well, because that will be reviewed in line with the comments that you make in regard of this, because the Constitution is the public facing document as well, and that is as Councillor Kilbane indicated, that is the legal framework for the council going forward. So, you know, it's a lot bigger than the current constitution. It's a lot more explicit in terms of who can do and what. So Appendix 1 is constantly under review and will take on board your feedback. So it may not necessarily be appropriate in here, but the more details will be in our more transparent kind of rule book, if you like, of the constitution going forward. So Appendix 1, staffing conditions section, is remaining under review to take into account comments from this committee.
Can I just clarify, just as a supplementary, sorry, I didn't, oh, no, go on. In 6.3, you then make reference to where a severance payment is being made for senior, the statutory officers, the head of paid service. The monitoring officer will lead that process, seeking approval from the section 151 and SMU. You've just talked about you as the chief legal officer. When the monitoring officer is also the chief legal officer, which is likely to be the case, what happens then if we're talking about the monitoring officer's special severance payment? There must be a separate independent legal advice procedure.
So there's when it comes to statutory officers, there's always lots of independent legal advice on behalf of the statutory officer and on behalf of the council as the employer. There's also, we're required to have reciprocal arrangements as well with a neighbouring authority. And also it's more likely than not under the JNC terms and conditions for chief officers and specialist statutory officers that an organisation such as the LGA would be involved as well.
Okay.
So
does that need writing down anywhere?
So we can put it in, but it's quite detailed in the JNC handbook for chief executives. So
could
again,
you make reference to the JNC handbook?
Appendix 1 and Appendix 12 all have considerable detail. So Appendix 12 in the new constitution deals quite considerably with officer employment and specific responsibilities. But we do have cases such as myself or Debbie, we do have reciprocal arrangements. In respect of my role, it's with North Yorkshire County Council. So if it was about me, Ian would need a monitoring officer support or a chief legal officer support. And the reciprocal arrangement is with North Yorkshire County Council for my role, for example.
Lovely, thank you. Councillor Lomas again.
Yeah, thank you. Listen to what you said, Janie, and I do appreciate that what you're saying is that this legal assessment would be independent, which is what we would hope for, but that's not what it says here. And I think that given the circumstances that led to the PIR, we need to be really clear that such a legal assessment would be an independent legal assessment. And I think that every time that is referenced in here, it should be, it should say independent or something like that, or you put it in the definitions to say where the term legal assessment is used, that there should be some independence from the decision-making process, because otherwise you have the person who's involved in the decision-making process in most cases, which is yourself, also making the legal assessment. If it was to be done as it is written, not as you would practically do it yourself, because you might not always be the monitoring officer for the City of York Council. So I think that it needs to be clear. We need to learn the lessons that we needed to learn from what has happened, and the whole point of this was a review to put those lessons into practice by writing them down on paper.
Absolutely get your point. However, when it comes to a very high level, kind of strategic level, the chief legal officer of the council, all legal advice is in the name of the chief legal officer of the council at the most highest strategic level. So because I am the only person that is authorised by the council to commission legal advice, because I'm a qualified solicitor, and that is what the constitution states. So I have the discretion to instruct independent solicitors, but the advice received, shared with the council, would still be in the name of the council's chief legal officer, if that makes sense. Practically, it may come from this waterbottle.co.uk legal firm, whatever it is, but it would still be commissioned by me, and therefore in property terms of information property, and for the purposes of the constitution in law, it is technically that owned by the chief legal officer, because I am the most senior solicitor. So for example, all of my legal team obtain advice in my name, and because that is the governance arrangement around the commissioning of legal advice, and all proceedings are issued in my name, for example. But I absolutely understand what you mean in this. I think if I discuss with Debbie and Trudy outside of this meeting, we can come up with a form of words so that it actually kind of mirrors the constitution as well, because this document is probably less easy to find going forward if I'm not here, rather than the constitution is very easy to find. That's my intention. It's publicly available. That's the statement and expression of what we do, how we do things, etc. So we can also look at both documents after your feedback. For me, the absolute priority is that the constitution would always take precedence in terms of decision making, because that is how we set out how we're going to do things. So I'll look at the wording outside of that, take in board your comments and look at the wording outside of that, because I just need to make sure it's consistent with the constitution going forward.
But if that's going to, if Councillor Lomas's suggestion is taken on board for the SMU meeting on the 20th of September, that then therefore needs to have been a recommendation from this committee. And for that to happen, I think we would need approval from the committee that they would like you to take that forward.
So again, back to governance, this report can only go to SMU once A&G are happy with its contents. So I apologise to keep referencing the constitution, but if you feel that you need to revisit this report in line with the constitution of relevant appendices or articles in the constitution, that is the gift of Audit and Governance Committee. Just because the recommendation says here it will go to the 20th of September, this is written on the premise that you've spent this evening going, yes, this is absolutely fine, we don't want to see it again, etc. It was also written on the premise that the constitution would follow on.
I'm not saying that we're not going. I'm not saying, Jenny, that we're not going to get to a position where we can approve this. What I'm asking you basically is, if we are proposing changes to this, which we won't then subsequently see again before it goes to SMU for agreement. If you're going to take it to Trudy and to Debbie for further discussions and then changes, there needs to be a final filtering, if you like. Councillor Lomas.
Chair, I think maybe what Janie was trying to say was we could look at this again before it goes to SMU. It doesn't have to go to SMU on the 20th of September.
No, fine.
No,
so we can come back on the 29th of September.
Just because the ultimate decision makers are yourselves. So we write a recommendation for consideration and have advised you on next steps. So if, for example, you had no more questions, you were content with, just for example, the one inclusion of a definition of reference to chief officers, we could do that technical change and you were content with it. If on that basis you were happy with it, it could go then to SMU. However, if you decide that you'd like to see a revised version of this, if you decide that you'd like to see it in line with something else, then it simply doesn't go. You do have that discretion.
I do understand.
So it goes to next month's SMU. So absolutely, it's a discretion. So you shouldn't feel that you're kind of over a barrel in having to agree this evening. It is. I've already made reference to lots of new appendices in the Constitution, which we're not discussing this evening, and you may feel that you need that before you make a more informed decision.
Okay.
It's an option. Your other option is that you just don't like this at all and you never see it again. That is also another extreme option.
Now, I've got some, sorry, Councillor Fisher, before I go on to my questions. Tony.
My concern is about what I think is a bit of an issue. I picked it up with Councillor, I think Kilbane made reference to it. We've got resignation, we've got retirement due to ill health, dismissal, we've got the mutual termination, which is what all football clubs seem to do. I feel we haven't covered redundancy. Now, are there positions within a redundancy settlement where a special severance payment could be paid? And if so, do we need further clarification of that particular area?
Trudy?
Yes, we'll add that in. I think it was raised by the public speaker. So in section 4, we will put reference to redundancy in there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor Webb.
Thank you. Just on that point, I mean, because part of the reason that we're here tonight is because this payment was described as a redundancy retire. I can't remember the phrase that was used at the time, was it? But the whole point was that this was not how it was described. So I am quite concerned about how we do fit that in, because we don't want to get back into a situation where we're saying, is this a retirement or is this a redundancy? That has to be kept really, really separate. I'm not saying it's not right to put that in, but actually, because we are where we are because of decisions that were made by, you know, the leader, then this is things that we need to just get right. So yes, I just thought I'd highlight that.
So,
thank you.
Can I then ask you, Trudy, just in that respect, that if you're saying that you're going to add a section as to what constitutes a redundancy and what constitutes something that is not a redundancy, where would that be incorporated within?
So in section 4, so this is not just about kind of settlement agreements in per se, it's trying to cover all exits. So in section 4, we cover reasons for people exiting the organisation, be that from normal resignation through to what could be a mutual termination of contract. So it should also include in there the redundancy reference, and probably more so on the retirement on grounds of business efficiency as well. So it's clear that we've got all those definitions in there so that it makes it clear. So I note that, so it will be in that section.
Good. Right, I think we're all happy with that. Councillor Webb.
Thank you. It was just more on legal advice, since we were talking about that earlier on. 6.15C, it says legal advice that the special severance payment appears to offer good value for the council, may not be conclusive, since such advice may not take account of the wider public interest. And I was wondering if we could firstly explain how has this changed since, well, in the last couple of years, or was this always been the position of the council? And I suppose, how is this outlined clearly on the new form and things like that? And I suppose the other part for me would be, with legal advice that the council seeks, as you've said that you've got a team of one and you would seek external legal advice. What happens to that? Is that public, and does it come with assurances? So actually, further on, for example, it says in 6.16B, it talks about where legal advice is finely balanced. So how is that presented to the public?
So all legal advice is confidential unless the author of it or the recipient of it waives the right to legal professional privilege. And you also have to take into account the other party to this, because there would be two parties to this dispute. So you do have to take that into account. There is also a role here around value for money, around wider public interest. You are required to consult with external audit. So you are required to inform them of the steps that you take. You're required to seek their views if they're willing to give it, and you're required to update them in terms of steps that are being proposed and who is involved. And also, where necessary, internal audit are also involved in terms of a surety of steps that are taken. So it's like a check and balance kind of function. Now, internal audit don't have a direct role in saying, no, you can't do that, but they have like an observation role that says, well, have you done? And it is like that check and balance issue. But the legal advice is again, I think it's described earlier in the process, and Trudy might want to pick this up as well, is that you would have to consult with, as part of the process for approval, with the executive member that is nominated, and I think the form does address that. And so you did follow that process through, but the advice would not be widely publicly available, because both parties would have to waive that, and there may be particular circumstances where it could be made available, but those are, to be honest, really quite rare. Really quite rare, because they involve very personal circumstances, and many people are not willing to make personal issues very public. There is an expectation, though, on a degree of greater transparency. So the more senior you are, there is an expectation on greater transparency, but that doesn't mean the automatic waiving of legal professional privilege and putting everything in the public domain, because that person is still an individual, and they have a right to privacy, private, personal, professional, financial, sort of confidentiality as well. So it's a very, very difficult circumstances, but there are external functions that are involved in this.
Can I just ask, sorry, can I just ask a supplementary? I will come back to you. So it is what you've just said about external audit, internal audit being involved. Is that a new proposal, or has that always historically been in place? I don't know whether it's Trudy I should be asking, or yourself, Janie.
Well, I can't comment for York in terms of deeply historic basis, because I've not been here long enough. But external audit, I did involve external audit.
Right.
In the most recent example, which I think everybody is aware of, my practice, I think if you're aware of my career as a monitoring officer, my practice in previous authorities was to consult with external audit, because they have to give the opinion on value for money, or at least be consulted and offered the opportunity to give an opinion on value for money. They may not choose to give it. Some external auditors are very clear that we listen, full stop. Other external auditors, depends on the firm, it depends on characters, it depends on all sorts of factors. Some firms are more willing to give you an opinion or a view than others as well. But it is a practice that I've adopted. It's a practice that is best practice to do if you're a monitoring officer in this position, or chief legal advisor in this position.
Do you have anything to add, Trudy?
Nothing really. I think Janie's covered it. I think in the more high-profile cases that we've had, then the external audit have been advised and have listened to the practice and the process that we're following. I think we do have other low-level kind of settlement agreements that I've gone through previously that we wouldn't involve external auditing.
Yeah. And internal audit?
I can't say for.
The more senior the role, the more likely you are to involve internal audit, because internal audit, as we've said in this report, that's more of the annual overview. But the more senior you are, the more encouraged it is that you have that external oversight, or that arm's length oversight that, for example, internal audit can follow.
So given that internal audit, for example, would know intimately the processes of this council and any other council, for that matter, why weren't internal audit consulted in the most recent high-profile case?
I'd have to go back over and look at whether they were or weren't. I can't say.
You can't say categorically that they weren't.
Categorically they were or they weren't, so I'd have to go back and have a look at that.
Thank you.
I think there is something that we could, if you wanted to, for chief officers, and the definition being in here, if it's a chief officer one going to staffing matters and urgency, whether you wanted to include internal audit as part of that process.
I personally think that would be helpful. I'm looking to the rest of the committee.
That does, Chair, if I may just add, that does kind of echo the sentiment that we're putting in recommendation 3, is that rather you receive an officer report, you're actually receiving the external assurance or semi-external assurance or independence from internal audit, because the internal audit have that overarching view of the council's business. So
Exactly.
therefore, in echoing recommendation 3, that the spirit of recommendation 3 is that we're formalising more of the role, that oversight role of internal
It's
audit,
just the
and that
independence
cover
of those checks and
all
balances,
levels
isn't
of
it?
staff.
So yes, if everybody's in agreement, then yeah, I think it would be appropriate for that to be included. Were there any other questions? Yes, I thought you had an extra.
Yeah, it was just one last little point, I suppose, because what you've said, Janie, is quite right. Obviously, Mazars did give an opinion. External audit were involved, and I'm sure that members around, people around here who involved them. But which gets me back to the point, like, there's nothing new here. Was it written down? Was this kind of document written down somewhere previously? Or is it just done on that's the way things have always been done?
So there was a previous process that was approved through Audit and Governance back in 2018. I think it was prior to the last election. So there was a process with a business case. I think what came out of this whole process is there wasn't enough information within that business case, and hence it's more detailed and looking at the kind of national advice and guidance to give that value for money exercise. So there was a previous process. This is more enhanced and in depth to give that evidence and background information upon which to make the decision.
And if I may, this one now incorporates the views that have come out of central government during the sort of early part of this year, which we've made reference to on page 14. So previous to that, there'd been central government guidance, but nothing statutory. So statutory guidance issued by the government means that the local authority is required to adopt, consider, follow. So it's not discretionary. So that's where we've made reference on the top of page 14 in terms of the MHCLG statutory guidance.
Councillor Fisher, sorry.
So on that then, on what you've just said, would it be possible, maybe not to us, but it could come back to us, I suppose, but to SMU on the 20th, in order for them to make an informed decision, is it possible to show them that version from 2018, compare it to this version now? So, because I think that might be helpful to see what's the same and what was therefore missed, and what is not the same and what has now been made more robust.
Councillor Fisher spoke to me earlier on today to say that link doesn't actually work. I don't think we need to look at it. It was just that he did want to have a look at it, but it's... Yeah.
But I have a further point.
You have a further point
On that issue.
On that issue.
Oh, no, on the issue we're just discussing with Councillor Webb.
Right. Yeah.
No, it's not an issue. Yeah. It's just that I wasn't party, unfortunately, to the, well, possibly fortunately, the SMU's decision. And I didn't see the business case. But I understand that one of the criticisms was the business case was not detailed enough to prove that it was an efficiency saving. Now, are we satisfied that there is sufficient evidence now in that final section, financial considerations, that an SMU will be able to make a very clear decision as to whether it is in the public interest, i.e. the efficiency of the council, to make a special severance payment? I mean, clearly, if you suggest we could see the original document and see this, that could be a way forward, so we can actually do a comparison to satisfy ourselves that we've plugged the hose.
Do either of you have a view on that?
Absolutely, look at it. This is the expectation, is that whoever fills this box in is very, very, very detailed, hence the guidance that is given in the italics there. So it's not a tick, this is not a tick box. This is almost like we expect an essay type of approach. So when you look at, for example, page 25, so when you look at the wording in italics, this is guidance to the author or to the writer of this is the minimum expectation, and you have to set out your reasoning, or you append a very detailed reasoning or whatever. So this is not a tick box exercise going forward, but we can consider that as well.
Trudy.
Yeah, I think on the lessons learned through going through all the public interest report, etc. I think in terms of the section 151 or the statutory officers looking at this as a business case before it going anywhere, I think the expectations are much higher in terms of that business case and explanation. And like I said, the guidance that's put down in here for what should be included in there as a minimum would be there.
So can I ask you a question now? 6.16, council's default approach is not to settle. We must ensure special severance payments are only made in exceptional circumstances and represent value for money. Special severance payments will only be considered if attempts to settle the dispute without special severance payments have been made and either legal advice has been sought. Now, what you then, in earlier sections, give loads of examples in which special severance payments can be made, including on 6.9, where a relevant legal assessment of any organisation's chances of winning or losing an employment tribunal claim and the potential value of any award may be made. In another section, you say that shouldn't necessarily be a criteria for settling. Now, I must admit, when I was reading this, I was kind of confused on if it looks as though we're going to lose and it will cost us money, we should settle. But then there's another section that's another part of this that says actually it's worth taking a case to tribunal because you do not want to be advantaging claims that are essentially without merit, but which may cost the council a lot of money if they lost them. So I'm just wondering whether it's as clear as it could be about what the default position is and what criteria will be used in respect of do we make this payment or do we not?
Chair, I think it's really difficult to, so I think my understanding is the default position of the council is we shouldn't be paying one unless in exceptional circumstances. So I believe that's the default position. I think the difficulties you've got is that each case is quite unique and has its own unique set of circumstances which will need to be considered at the time. So I think it would be difficult to put that steer and guidance in black and white, but my understanding, and I suppose the decision of the recommendation from this meeting and to staff matters and agencies around, my understanding is the default position will be, and the guidance from government is it should be not to settle and or not to pay the special any additional monies, and that it's only in exceptional circumstances. And if that's not clearly come through, then there's maybe some of the wording.
No, I'm sure you're right. I'm sure you're right. It was maybe just me not reading it properly. Councillor Lomas.
Can I just add to that?
Of course you can.
So it is right. The council's approach is if there is an employment tribunal, go to it. The references that you made at 6.9, this is advice or guidance to those who are considering the financial considerations that which we were trying to be explicit here, that don't just look at the number, you need to look at the more wider issue. So hence, if you're considering the financial considerations, you also need to take, where necessary, into account any legal assessment that's come in as part of making this fully informed decision as possible. But the default position, as far as I'm concerned, will always be, and I think there's been some national commentary on it coming out from central government as well, is that go to court, go to a tribunal, for example. And I think that was kind of around the local government circulars in May, because that was linked with all the MHCLG guidance and consultation at that time. And so we've just put expressly in here that the default position is not to settle. So there should not be an automatic assumption from an employee, for example, or the executive member that just settle it because that's the easy thing to do, or it pushes it it gets it out of the way and we move on to the next item or something.
Mhm.
Just want to say as well, every case is different because people are different, circumstances are different, and there's jobs are very different, how people conduct their jobs, etc. Whatever circumstance it is, they're always different. And when you look at back to Councillor Lomas's initial question of chief officer, there are different types of chief officer as well. Statutory chief officer versus a non-statutory chief officer. A statutory chief officer that is actually classed as discretionary because they're not recognised as statutory, so that's DCS DAS, for example, is not classed as
You'll
a,
have to
in
explain
legal
what a
terms.
DCS DAS
So
is.
Director of Children's Services and Director of Adult Social Services are not in local government legislation classed as statutory officers.
Right.
It is just monitoring officer, section 151, and head of paid service. So there's different classes of chief officer, which makes it adds to the uniqueness of every case.
Okay.
So that's probably why it's quite difficult for us to be really specific in this.
Fine.
I apologise.
Fine. Councillor Lomas had her hand up first, and then Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. I'm also on 6.15, but part D, which talks about apparently frivolous or vexatious appeals, but I'm not sure if it means appeal. I wasn't quite clear whether it meant a claim or an appeal, or perhaps both. I just have a little concern about the second bullet point in that section, where it says, where claims are genuine, it will ensure that prompt action is taken to ensure further grievances do not arise. I'm just querying whether that genuinely would be prompt action, because if you know something has gone wrong, you know that somebody is making a complaint because they have to have gone through internal processes before lodging a tribunal claim. A tribunal claim will take lots of time to go through, and potentially an appeal, because an appeal is referenced here, that's going to take a significant amount of time, and there's no way that that's the promptest way to ensure action is taken so that no further grievances arise. So I'm also looked back to 6.12C, which talks about evidence of lessons learned and a measurable improvement plan to reduce the risk of council having to make further payments. But it feels very much here like that bullet point is contradicting a lot of the other things in this section. If we want to take prompt action to make sure we don't make the same mistakes again, waiting to the end of a tribunal claim and appeal doesn't appear to be the most efficient way of doing that.
Trudy.
I would agree with those comments. I think we'll have a look at the wording and whether that's relevant in that section. So bullet point, we've probably picked that up from the national guidance, but is that actually correctly referenced? Yeah.
That's great, thank you. And Councillor Lomas, and then if there aren't any additional questions, I think we then need to start coming to... Oh, yes, you are. You look so similar.
That's really unfair on Councillor Lomas.
Councillor Webb.
Yeah, dear. Yeah, mine's more on the financial considerations in the actual form at the back. So on page 25, value for money consideration underline proposed payment. Now, I suppose one issue that we've had with the issue that has led to the rise of this, the public interest report, was part of the issue has been the then subsequent costs. So the additional costs of Mazars, we still don't know how much the setting up of this action plan will take. Obviously, it's been people's time to actually put all this stuff together, which again costs an awful lot of cash. Is that kind of thing going to be included? How do we, I know it's difficult to predict, but there has to be some sort of discussion surely in terms of the auditing costs and the cost of, is that going to be included within this document? Because obviously the money that we were talking about on the previous one was about, I think it was a payment of 130,000 that was the discretionary, but subsequently there was the 68,000 ex gratia, wasn't there? But then there have been lots of other subsequent payments, which have then added up to almost the same again. So it's just sort of, how do we fit that in?
So the technical responsibility for the VFM assessment is with the Section 151 officer, because that's on a financial footprint. And Debbie on this, if it was Debbie, for example, in this instance, doing that VFM assessment, she would have to take into account my professional opinion in, this is how much it's cost, this is precedent that we are aware of, or previous experiences, etc. She would also have to look at how many staff involved learning from this. For example, this exercise, this would feature in the VFM. She would also probably take into account any views that come from external audit if they were willing to express an opinion on VFM and look at what their attitude has been in the past to the council's approach to VFM in terms of the accounts, commentary made. So it is very much a financial technical reasoning taking into account views from myself, Trudy, head of paid service, or whoever happens to be involved. There's also a legal assessment that, and again, apologies, back to the independent legal advice that you receive in terms of the dialogue that they may have had with the other party's other party's legal advisor, whether there's involvement from ACAS, all sorts of issues. So it's kind of hard for me to say what Debbie's approach would be, but those are the sort of factors I would expect Debbie to take into account in terms of VFM. But it's very much a more chief financial officer assessment than it is a chief legal advisor assessment. So,
would that be where you would have reference from any opinion of Mazars from the external auditor or internal auditor in that section? Yeah.
I think with regards to future costs, I think you can't predict that at the time. I think the idea would be with this process and following the more detailed business case and the decision making based upon more detail, that we shouldn't get into the position that we've seen ourselves in, and therefore we shouldn't have the knock-on of costs of officers' time and external auditors, etc. So I think in answer to your question, we couldn't predict any future costs of it being challenged later on. I think the idea with this process is that we get everything in there so that the decision making is done correctly, and therefore there isn't any challenge at a later date.
This is quite brief as a follow-up. So 6.15b, precedents from other parts of the public sector may not always be a reliable guide in any given case. Whilst I accept that that might be true, it also might not be true. And I was wondering if there's, you know, surely there should be something maybe explaining a little bit about how you would use precedent from elsewhere. How, I mean, in the decision-making process, surely you have to consider, well, this happened in X council or that happened in Y council.
Yeah, if I can answer that. I think normally when we'd get that external legal advice from the specialists in the employment law field, they would normally have that knowledge and understanding, and that would come into that advice and guidance around what your next steps would be. So it's often that your lawyers are aware of cases that have gone through and what the outcomes have been. So that would form part of their advice and guidance to the council and their legal advice.
Yep, exactly. What we could not rely on is the public commentary as to why X left X council under what circumstances, because that's not always the very most accurate legal reflection of that particular individual circumstances. So, you know, we just have to.
Thank you. Can I just ask a really brief question? Mr. Mendes raised it, and I'm sure it's a yes or no answer. Are schools included within these special severance agreements payments?
So we've not specifically referenced them in this process. So the school's decision making is through the governing bodies, and they're the ones that make the decisions regarding the settlements. What's been done previously is that they're noted through the kind of audit and governance and things. So we're recommending that I suppose we should really write it in there in terms of being very clear that that's the process.
So you'll include it, but it's a no?
Yes.
Yeah, great. I hope you're happy. Thank you. Councillor Fisher.
Can I just clarify, I presume that only applies to maintained schools and doesn't apply to academies?
I'm looking at you,
So
Trudy,
yes,
maintain
academies
schools.
have a completely different business model, completely different governance arrangement which is outside the council. So we wouldn't be involved in that. It's a business. Academies are run by businesses in effect, so they're kind of very much nothing to do with us. So yes, you're right.
Correct. Well, if they weren't, as a member of this committee, you wouldn't be here. So.
Okay. So I'm just going to ask are there any colleagues that haven't asked a question up to now, whether they have any questions? And then I'll ask Councillor Webb. I'm really sorry, Bob. Councillor Webb, and then we'll look at the recommendations. Councillor Webb.
Thank you. Firstly, Councillor Fisher's last comment was in reference to me, as I do work for an academy trust, and he was stating that if I work for a maintained school that I wouldn't be allowed to be a councillor of this council, which is true, and I'm not sure why it was relevant. But anyway, my final question would be, obviously we've talked about the information that was here previously, the information that we've got here now, and we've said that actually, although this is far more robust, or at least it might be, I've not seen the previous one, but I assume it is, in comparison to the previous one, in reality, nothing much has changed. So that leads me to the reason we're here tonight, was obviously the decisions made by the members of that SMU at the time that led to the public interest report, that led to where we are now. And I suppose, will there be special training for those members, particularly the leader of the council, regarding this new process, this new document? Will that take place?
I would argue further than that, not just SMU. I would argue that any executive member that is consulted in respect of a severance payment should have training beforehand.
So, Chair, I'd go even further than that, and that actually what I will be asking members to consider going forward is that the suite of mandatory training for all 47 councillors is much broader than just linked to specific topics. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that as the monitoring officer I've been quite concerned about the poor level of member development that's on offer or not, or the consistency of member development being offered since you were elected in 2019. I'm really conscious that the action plan is not on tonight's agenda, but part of the role of the action plan is that various aspects such as model code of conduct, as mandatory training, there's a vast amount of statutory mandatory training required as a result of the implementation of a new constitution. So there is many members who are going to receive kind of a programme of what is deemed to be mandatory training. Now, what we're looking at going forward is that's not going to be classroom based, because that's not always practical, of getting people in a room at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, for example. What we're currently looking at with myself and colleagues is a kind of a hybrid suite of different styles of training. So it could be you can watch something in your own time. It could be a bit of live stream type training that you are required to sit through at a certain point. It will also be checks and balances, and it will be also positive reporting of who has done this and who has not done this. So there's going to be, if my suggestions are sanctioned, and there will be discussion with Joint Standards Committee as well, because we've already raised it as part of the work plan with Joint Standards Committee, is that the council, full council, needs to hold its members to account in terms of you did or did not do that training, but there is an expectation of full council of what it's going to be. The idea is that by 2023, immediately following the election, there's a lot more helpful, vibrant induction program and a full suite of member development program that takes you through the 4 years, rather than you do everything in the first 3 months in immediately after the election, and then we pray and fall silent. So it's probably quite aspirational. I think it's good practice to openly discuss member development, but also I think it's also very good that you don't just restrict it to certain functions, because all members need to understand how the council operates, and, you know, the constitution is hopefully changing quite considerably. So all members need to have a better understanding of the more global responsibilities of the council. So that's the approach that I would be taking going forward. But I'm conscious it does need to go through Joint Standards Committee as part of the ethical governance framework. And obviously yourselves will be consulted, but all members will be consulted independent of which committee you sit on.
I mean, I certainly, and you know, it was raised by one of the, oh, sorry, I was
just going to add to that in terms of the practical application when this process is approved, because obviously we need to make sure that, because this could happen at any time in terms of the use of this, then I think a recommendation too that I will liaise with executive members and corporate management team, also corporate leadership group and all of HR to make sure with that I do a kind of training session briefing around what this means going forward on a practical level, because that needs to happen sooner rather than later, and then linking in with the bigger programme of work.
Yeah, and certainly I think member training, it was raised actually earlier on in public participation. It's something, and you know, I don't think you will be unusual in your concern and disappointment about the level of training across a range of areas that councillors get. So yeah, I mean, certainly I would support any proposal. I don't know how this would be progressed, because you say you've got to discuss it and who needs to approve that, but certainly an effective induction and then subsequent training you know, would be I think would be beneficial for all of us across a whole range of areas. And to take the public participants' point, I could do with a bit of chairing training, couldn't I? Right, so I think the consensus is that we are not. Yes, exactly. That we are not happy for this to go forward in the format in which it has been given to us this evening, and you've made notes of a number of areas that I think were raised as issues, and that this should therefore come back to a subsequent committee, and we can have we've got to look at that in a minute anyway, to be decided for later on in today's meeting. Trudy,
can I just check that the committee will be happy with the track changes report coming back so that you can see what changes have been made? Would that be more helpful? Or
yeah, I think it would be useful, yes, if you give us this with track changes
and a clean copy.
Yeah, and a clean copy, yeah. Are members minded to agree to that? Yeah, thank you. Councillor Lomas.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm just wondering, is that feasible to do for our next meeting? Because I'm just thinking about the amount of times that Janie has answered questions by referencing the Constitution. And whenever we come back to the Constitution, it would be good to look at this at the same time so that we can make sense of those links. I don't know if that's...
I can get this back for the
unreasonable.
So the next, Chair, the next meeting is, the next official meeting of this committee is the 29th of September. Because we were supposed to be looking at the Constitution, the work plan was not put on the agenda at the Chair's, with the Chair's sanction. However, there have been lots of changes in circumstances over the last 24 hours, which means that the Chair would like the committee to look at the work plan, because our external auditors have indicated that they are not going to be in a position to look at the final statement of accounts on the 29th of September, and they've only let the Section 151 know that in the last 24 hours.
So that would be agenda item 5, which would be the review of the council's constitution. And as Janie has pointed out, and as seems to be the worst kept secret in the world, we're not in a position to consider this agenda item this evening. And I would just like to just make some comment, because I understand that there will have been interest in the Constitution, both from members and from members of the public. And the fact that we're not in a position to consider that this evening is a matter of significant regret to me. However, I felt after consultation with the monitoring officer and the vice chair that we were left in with no alternative but to defer this item. Members may recall, and I believe all the members at this committee were here at the last occasion, we did ask for a hard copy of the draft constitution in good time. We did not receive that copy until, for some members, until Friday, or I think possibly even later. Councillors Fisher, Lomas and myself managed to pick up a copy at but only because we asked for it to be made available for us at a planning committee. So it's not an ideal set of circumstances. I have asked that there be investigations made as to why the papers weren't supplied to us. But for those of you that have seen it online, it runs to almost 800 pages. You may see on various desks a big bundle of papers that members have brought with them this evening. There is no way that we could have done this justice with 3 or 4 days worth of reading. So I am proposing that we defer this. And the question then is, deferring to when?
Chair, can I just for technical reasons confirm that before you actually defer this, there does need to be a slight debate on the Constitution before you defer the item of the Constitution, because within this particular section you do want to just address the substitutes issue.
Oh,
so before you
you're
actually do decide
right.
to defer it to an future
right.
meeting, there is an issue of the Constitution under this agenda item that we just do need to address.
More
Sorry,
amateurish
Chair.
chairing from me.
Apologies, can I just check, are we finished with that agenda item, my agenda item?
Yes.
Yes. Can I have permission?
Of course you
to leave?
can.
Thank you.
Of course you can. Thank you very much, Trudy. Yes, we will be bringing this back on the 29th of September, ideally. The
exit strategies.
The exit strategy. Because that will be when I will be proposing that we look at the Constitution, and I think that there was hope that we could look at these two things in conjunction. Yes? No. You're not convinced, are you?
Apologies, Chair, but I think I'm having a senior moment week, but I was just a little bit confused because there is a lot of items that we do need to just have a debate on the work plan, even though it's not on the agenda, because of we also have them make it.
We will tell you when it's coming back.
Oh yes, I'm a bit confused now.
Yeah,
so,
no, we'll tell you when it's coming back. Thank you. Right. We will come to that in a second. We'll look at the substitutions issue, which all members will be aware was going to be coming to tonight's meeting anyway. As just a little bit of background, on the 20th of March 2020, I think, which was the last physical committee that we actually had, this committee made a decision in respect of standing orders relating to committees. And you have before you the relevant agenda standing orders. Yes, and in section 6.5, the change was in section C, subsection 1. We have a spare copy. No, it was just an additional bit, which says, where no named substitute is available, a political group may instruct the chief executive or monitoring officer to replace for the duration of a particular meeting an existing member with another substitute identified by the political group. And then what we changed was to add, provided always that this provision 6.51C, section C, subsection 1, will not apply to planning, licensing and regulatory or joint standards committee or any subcommittees thereof. We made that, that change with all good intentions, but the law of unintended consequences have been such that it has been difficult for all political groups to find substitutions for planning committee. And that has left some planning committees with, and I'm talking about main planning, which is the one I sit on, with relatively fewer numbers than they would ideally have. And the proposal is that we remove that amendment that we made in March 2020.
Yes,
Is that correct?
by the deletion of the word planning.
By the deletion of the word planning, yes. Because it doesn't refer to, like, it doesn't,
No,
it's
I've
not
not
relevant to licensing or joint standards anyway.
No, I've not received any concerns about being very close to the minimum chorusy issues for licensing and regulatory or joint standards committee. So this
But
is
we were at the,
just the concerns around planning,
planning
committee. So yes, so I'm just proposing to remove the word planning from that element of the constitution.
Thank you, I'll second that. I chair the planning committee.
Mike?
Sorry, I will get into the habit of doing that eventually. I chaired the planning committee of August the 5th. I think there were 10 members out of instead of 15. I know all groups tried to get extra people, but unfortunately there were planning trained councillors available who were not named substitutes. And I would rather have a planning committee with a decent attendance, so there's a good level of good considered debate. So I will strongly second that.
Thank you. Is there any debate, or do you just want us to go to a vote? Councillor Mason.
I'm not going to be controversial about planning. Obviously, my interest is in licensing, and licensing committees are normally relatively well attended, but actually licensing subcommittees are very poorly attended, and there's certain members pick up a lot of work and certain ones don't, because some hearing held during the day and people work and everything else. Is there any reason why other substitutes can't be used in licensing? I feel like there is a legal thing around once you're named, it could be those people, but I just thought I'd check.
I'm not sure I heard all of the comment, I'm afraid, because I'm struggling to hear this evening, but the licensing subcommittee is 3. You have to be trained in licensing in order to sit on a licensing subcommittee. And this is more about availability of members and willingness to attend. We're not exactly awash with volunteers to attend on licensing subcommittees for a variety of reasons. They are the most difficult for us to populate when we need to establish a licensing subcommittee. But can I just say that the next steps proposal, because there isn't a covering report about this element. If Audit and Governance Committee are willing to confirm the deletion of the word planning from this particular reference of the current constitution, which is section 4, section 4B of the current constitution at paragraph 6.51, then I would take a report to full council in October and ask for the amendment of this element of the constitution to be approved by full council.
Thank you.
So I didn't
If you
really
want the
answer.
reference in the current in the proposed constitution, if you're looking for the reference, that will be in Article 7, paragraph 14, and I've already removed the word planning from that particular section. So if you're looking for this evening's agenda, it's section Article 7.
Councillor Lomas. Oh, sorry, Councillor Mason.
Sorry, Councillor Lawrence. The sound in here in this room is rubbish, so I'm sorry if you didn't hear me. But I suppose the point was, is there any reason? Yes, they've got to be trained, but I mean, it's an hour sat with Leslie. It's not a hugely onerous task. Is there any reason why we couldn't look to extend that pool of people to delete and look at deleting that line as well to make sure we have more people available for licensing hearings?
So technically in licensing, you are supposed to be a member of the licensing committee. So it's not as easy. The regulatory framework around licensing is under different legislation. It's very specific outside of the local government legislation. So technically, in order to be on the licensing subcommittee, you have to be a member of the main licensing committee. So it is a lot more restricted, I'm afraid, than it is in planning, where the main prime requirement is that you've received planning training. For licensing, you have to be trained and you have to be a member of the main licensing committee.
Thank you.
Councillor Lomas.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to clarify for the benefit of members of the public, really, that it wasn't lack of willingness to attend planning meetings that was the issue. It was people isolating for the good of their colleagues, for the good of council officers and members of the public. And I think that even though the official legislation around isolating is over, I think that we should still be encouraging the protection of everyone's health and safety. If somebody has any kind of infectious, virus, disease, anything like that, they should not be attending meetings. And so we could have this situation again. So I just want to clarify for members of the public who won't necessarily have been party to all of the discussions we'll all been having about, heck, how can we manage to get some substitutes who don't have to isolate. But this is for the public good that people were staying away from meetings.
I will 100% agree with that and those sentiments. We have members been unavailable because they were doing the right thing. And sorry, did you want to
just to confirm, that is exactly the circumstance that has arisen. And the officer side as well.
Yes.
There are significant numbers of teams that are really, really struggling with accommodating annual leave, illness, COVID-related illness, caring for others as well, which is leaving the officer corps very, very short-staffed in certain key areas.
So I'm just going to ask for a formal vote because we are making an amendment. So to revoke the word planning from section 6.51, subsection C, paragraph C, subsection 1. Is that right? Taking the word planning out, basically.
Chair, I'll ensure that Robert has the right sort of references for the purposes of the minutes, but yes, I'll delete the word planning from
all
that
those in
section.
favour? Unanimous. Yeah, marvellous. Thank you. So we are now just going to go through the work plan to confirm the details of the next opportunity to discuss the Constitution. And we do have a proposal that the Constitution comes to the meeting of the 29th of September, which is our next scheduled meeting. Now, as you've heard, the agenda items that were originally listed for the 29th of September included the final statement of accounts, including the annual governance statement and Mazars' annual audit letter. And Mazars have made it clear that they're not in a position to do that. So I'm proposing that those two agenda items be moved to the meeting of the 20th of October. The other agenda items are internal audit and fraud plan and progress report. So that's essentially one of the regular progress reports that we receive from Verito. I'm also proposing that we move that agenda item to a subsequent date, and I will liaise with the monitoring officer and the section 151 officer. We've then got the monitoring officer's update and progress against the action plan. And we've got the LGA coming.
Yes,
Sorry.
Chair. So in respect of the progress against the action plan, I have the LGA in attendance.
Yeah.
In respect of that item, so it'd be quite difficult for that item to move.
So that needs to
from
stay.
the agenda.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then we've also got the Make It York contract management agenda item. And that's in relation to the limited assurance audit that we received that must come, that, well, the committee has agreed will come to committee. And this was the date that we set for it. I would propose that we keep that agenda item, but if there are alternative views on that, I'm more than willing to hear them. No? And then the review of the Constitution. Sorry, Bob. Councillor Ward.
With the review of the Constitution, I note that we've got it on this action plan for several points tonight, which didn't go well. The 20th of October, and then got it again at anywhere? No. I wonder if I mean, it's taken us 2 hours, pretty much 2 hours to get through 27 pages. And fair enough, it's a big topic that we wanted to do right, and we had the opportunity, so we should, and I fully accept it was mainly me talking. But 800 pages, I think it's just going to be ridiculous. Now, for me, would it be possible to sort of say, so for example, what Councillor Loma suggested earlier about looking at the Constitution in alongside the item we've discussed tonight, would it make sense to say, actually, well, we'll look at a particular section that is relevant to what we've discussed tonight at a meeting in the near future, and then at another meeting later in the municipal year, we look at a separate section. I mean, for us to sit down, had we done that and sat down tonight to look at all of that, the same thing would have happened again, which happened last March, which was we did very high level stuff and missed loads. And that would be my suggestion, is actually taking that and breaking it up into lots and lots and lots of pieces and taking our time over this.
Thank you. Councillor Carr.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with Councillor Ware, but could we not split the Constitution update, or whatever we call it, a revision, into either bite-sized chunks, that we take at every meeting going forward, or we look at where the constitution has changed, if that could be highlighted, or we take those as a priority.
Okay, so there's page 41. So there's a we've included a cross-reference document, a part of this. The cross-reference, I'm just looking at my copy, starts on page 35 and cross-references. That is where the current constitution has been transposed into the new proposed constitution. So if you use a cross-referencing, where that area is silent or there's lack of specific comment, it's those functions are actually new additions to the constitution. To do a track change is, provide you with a track change document is, to be fair, virtually impossible, because the structure and the skeleton of the two constitutions are vastly, vastly different. The current constitution follows the 2000 model framework that was proposed and is in 7 chapters. How we've written this one is in 2 distinct separations. So as we say in the covering report, one is articles, of which there are quite a volume of them, and then there's a separate kind of chapter, if you like, of appendices, which is broken down into significant degree all of the detail from the 7 chapters and given them each their own little mini kind of section or chapter. And we've also included a lot of the protocols that were missing from the current constitution. I don't know why they were removed, but they were, and I don't think that's right. I've also been a lot more detailed in, so the scheme of delegation is now nearly 100 pages long, because I'll take into account what you've done. The scheme of delegation in the current constitution is about 4 pages in comparison. So to do a track change document means that, well, I don't think I could physically write a track change document based on the current constitution compared to what I proposed to you. It is just so different.
I'm not arguing for that, Chair. What I'm saying is that we highlight where it's changed. We don't literally physically highlight, but we take those parts which are changing. We look at those as a priority, or we split down to say 5 articles per meeting, and we review it on that basis. But whichever, I take Councillor Webb's point of view. To do a massive document like this in 1 meeting, it's just, we're not going to make any sensible decisions at the end of it.
Completely accept that. No matter how we do it, it's going to be an arduous, really, really long task, because just doing the dotting I's and crossing T's on in March 2020 took 4 hours alone. That was with the previous monitoring officer. So that in itself, just dotting I's and crossing T's, did take 4 hours. So if we'd had a bit of a debate today, you're all aware that the model code of conduct goes to October full council. So any reference to the model code of conduct, particularly in the appendices, would not be, I would not encourage this committee to look at any element of that. So that is all about the model code of conduct. That is all the planning guidance. That is the conflict of interest guidance that goes to sitting on an outside body, because all of that will have to be reviewed if full council adopts the model code. And then there is views from Joint Standards Committee, because there's all the associated procedures and practices which need to be reviewed by the Joint Standards Committee, which would also be replaced by the insertions in here. So there is a vast chunk of this that, had we been having this full debate this evening, I would have said, please do not touch that. There's also instances such as the Sacre Constitution this committee cannot look at, because Sacre is the governing body of that constitution. So there are certain elements which you can't look at this particular moment in time. The only caveat that I would put on, in terms of it taking a number of months to go to the constitution, is that this committee is the custodian of delivery against the action plan. The action plan has got a lot of work in it, which goes at quite some pace to get various issues embedded within a new governance framework, a new constitution. So, for example, scheme of delegation, conflicts of interest. The longer it takes this committee to go through the constitution means there is more delay on delivery against the action plan. As the monitoring officer and the section 151 officer, that has kind of significant implications on the approval of the statement of accounts and the annual governance statement, because external audit would expect a very clean year of governance and delivery of decision making prior to them giving us a clean bill of health on on the area of their annual opinion that deals with governance. So there are some complication factors and time frame issues, which I apologise, Chair, I just have to bring to the committee's attention, because on the 29th, we would then have to significantly review the delivery against the action plan and the implementation plan, because it's not going at the pace which I know Councillor Lomas was expressing at that time.
Councillor Lomas.
Thank you, Chair. I think some of the things you've just said, Janie, would be really helpful for us to understand. So just even giving us a list of the things that we shouldn't look at will greatly help in terms of the speed of going through this. And I totally accept that work needs to be done, and we need to do it quickly. But I think we also need to get it right. And I think probably what we need to have in mind is what happens once we've done our work. So once we've done our work on the Constitution, it goes to full council. Is that right? Have I understood that correctly?
Yes, once you've done your work, it can only go to full council once you are happy that it is a fit for purpose document that can be recommended for adoption by full council. That is excluding the model code of conduct, because that is in the ethical governance element of it, is within the remit of the Joint Standards Committee, as Councillor Carr and Councillor Fisher are aware. So it's the Joint Standards Committee, but they worked in conjunction with Councillor Pavlovic and dual-hatted Councillor Fisher, and on an audit perspective of looking at that. So the only other document which this committee does not have oversight on is SACRE, Standing Advisory Board on Religious Education in Schools. That is by law, this committee does not have the oversight on that. By law, SACRE as an independent body has to be satisfied of its constitution, and it refers directly to full council for adoption. So that is the other one that this committee does not have the, you can look at it by all means, absolutely, but you don't have to give the approval for that particular section.
I was just conscious that there is a small section called, well, no, it's not that small, a relatively small section called the Constitution, which contains the articles, and then there are a number of appendices. Would it be feasible, and I'm asking for your guidance on this, Janie, would it be feasible to look first at the Constitution and deal with the appendices in a prioritised order separately, so that we could get the Constitution bit and the priority appendices done first and go to full council, and then the appendices that have lower priority because they're not so involved in terms of the action plan could be looked at in slightly slower time.
You have a view?
I do have a view. The article that I would ask you to really consider is the terms of reference for this committee, because I've completely rewritten it since the last time you approved the amended version of the terms of reference for this committee. So I would ask you to prioritise that, because I think that's important for this committee to understand its role, function, purpose. And I have completely rewritten that. So that's Article 9 from memory. I've substantially altered Article 12, which is the shareholder committee, which I know that there is interest of this committee, and also corporate scrutiny. Sorry, my memory this week is awful. I would also ask you to look at Article 7, which is decision making, which also includes the Section 151's revised decision around what a key decision is, to make it more plain English. My approach to the Constitution has been much more plain English, because you have got to stand in the shoes of the members of the public when you read this, and that's where you're understanding this is. So I've tried to not use jargon where possible, but I have fallen into that trap. When it comes to appendices, however, if we look and focus on the council procedure rules, excluding anything relating to the model code of conduct, I would ask you to look at Appendix 1 as a priority, which is the scheme of delegation for the council. So this is who does what and when and why, and the how you interpret the decision making of a key decision, for example, into practicality. So the responsibility of functions and scheme of delegation will be close to 100 pages long, because I'll take into account the views that you've already shared this afternoon. And that is really how we make a decision on whatever, who makes the decision on what are everybody's statutory or discretionary responsibilities. So I would definitely look at Appendix 1. So that features really quite highly. I've made greater clarity around Appendix 7, which is access to information procedure rules. Who can see what and when and for why, and which reasons and what entitlements you've got. The other issue, if you're going to look at the shareholders committee, is we've introduced new guidance, which I think is good practice, which is Appendix 18, which is guidance to councillors and officers appointed to outside bodies. So this includes tech-al companies, charities, any external organisation that the council always appoints a councillor to. My strong advice is never ever sign anything when you're appointed to those, because you could end up with a personal liability regardless. But that is also clarity around, does your role as a councillor come first, or does your role to that outside body come first, etc. So I would prioritise that in terms of governance. The other issues, really, I'm at the discretion of this committee of it either sparks an interest. I would imagine that when you look at budget and policy framework, financial procedure rules, contract procedure rules, that's 9, 10, 11, that might be something. Debbie always brings a review of those in any event of financial procedure rules and contract procedure rules that it may be of lesser priority because they're least changed. But I'm quite happy thereafter to go at your preference. I will have to bring back, or a joint meeting with Joint Standards Committee, issues around the model code and the implications if full council approves that. You may wish to have a joint meeting with Joint Standards Committee. There are some dual-hatted members present.
So if you're, sorry, did you?
Yeah, just to check. So it would be possible for us to look at the Constitution section and the articles in the Constitution, and essentially send that then on its own to full council and look at appendices separately, and then send them to full council as we go along, so that we are maintaining the pace that we need to maintain for the action plan, but allowing ourselves a little bit of prioritising so that we spend our time wisely.
Disagree with everyone?
I'm kind of just looking at the challenges of actually then interpreting a hybrid constitution, because I've substantially updated it. The articles are effectively, this is what we're required to do. I think what everybody will be interested in is, how do you do what you are required to do? So for me, the priority would be that you would look at this committee's terms of reference, Article 9, and then you would look at the Appendix 1, which is the scheme of delegation and responsibility of functions. It's Appendix 1, which would Article 9, in terms of your terms of reference, gives you the confidence and the ability and the gravitas to do the significant assurance test and have the oversight. But Appendix 1, which is the scheme of delegation, the responsibility of functions, says who can do what is the limits of who can do what, etc.
And if you can, if colleagues recall, we have visited this issue of delegated powers and spending on numerous occasions, and said, the system that we had, we weren't comfortable with, and that needed marked amendments. So, I think it's pleasing that things have been addressed in this new version of the Constitution. I had Councillor Webb before Councillor Lomas, or is it a supplementary? It's supplementary, Councillor Lomas.
I wasn't really asking about what would be the priority order. It was just a yes or no answer I was looking at. Can we do them separately, or do we need to actually do everything all at once? So The problem that we have is that we could look at this in chunks and that would be fine, but that would mean that if the whole has to be looked at together by full council wouldn't get it until we had done all of our chunks, is sort of, I suppose, what I'm saying. Is there a way to send some sections to full council sooner, or would that be impossible? And from what you were saying, Janie, it sounds like that would not work. So I just want that clarified.
In terms of chunks, anything relating to the model code can go separately. So because Joint Standards Committee are looking at that, and that is, I can only amend the constitution after full council has potentially approved the model code. So anything which incorporates or makes reference to the member code of conduct, officer code of conduct, that would be for October. So that would go back to Joint Standards Committee post October, though admittedly they're doing some work this month as well. So they're starting on that. So that is a separate chunk. I think what may alleviate the pressure on this committee is I think it would be ideal to have some cross-party working groups. This is an issue that the chair's already raised with me, because then it's equivalent. If you approach it like a scrutiny work programme, you'd have an equivalent of a task and finish group or a subgroup or a work group that could look at this on a cross-party basis and then present this committee with either these are our feedback on this, or this is the issues that we feel are a challenge for this committee to look at, and that might alleviate some of the pressure from this committee and help with the time pressures.
I certainly, I would advocate, and I think one of the public speakers, Councillor Kilbane, had raised that as a proposal that I certainly think has a lot to commend it. A cross-party working group of people that are committed and interested in looking at the Constitution, I think would assist us no end. Councillor Lomas and then Councillor Webb.
I think you're answering a different question to the one I'm asking, because I totally agree. Let's go away and work on it in whatever way we want. What I'm saying is, do we have to look at the whole thing here and then send it all as a big bundle to full council, or can full council look at bits of it separately from each other, which would give us a bit of space? Because I'm trying to marry up here the pace required for the action plan versus the realistic.
I've asked this question. Councillor
I've
Lomas.
asked it 3 times this evening, I think, so far, and I just
when
want a yes or no.
When I previously asked this question, I was told that we couldn't send it in chunks, that it had to go as an entity, a complete entity.
Ideally,
now, if that's changing,
ideally it should go
us.
in a full entity, because it makes the interpretation, it makes the understanding for the members of the public, it makes all report authors, decision makers, everybody clear on what we're following. If I have to give advice on section 4 of the current constitution and then article 7 of the new constitution, becomes very difficult. So for me, ideally, it all goes to full council in one chunk and not in separate piecemeal sections.
So yeah, you still don't happy.
No, because what I said was the constitution, the articles that make up the constitution would go, along with the priority appendices, and then we could take the other appendices maybe as a separate chunk. I absolutely agree the constitution needs to be kept together, but there are a number of appendices, some of which are very lengthy. So this being the constitution, this being the appendices. So the suggestion wasn't that we would break up the constitution. The suggestion, and we're already breaking up the appendices because we're dealing with some of them at October full council.
I think now that you've just held it up and you've said the articles are the appendices, are the constitution, and then there's the appendices, it's all the constitution. So the 2 sections make one, so the articles need to be read in conjunction with the appendices.
Sorry, Janie, I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying is, would it cause a massive, constitutional problem if we sent some of the appendices to full council at a later meeting than the first ones. We're dealing with some of them at next full council, separately from the constitution review.
Yeah.
So why is it so impossible to do that with the rest of them?
So the ones that are potentially going after October is because they're under the remit of the Joint Standards Committee. So that's the model code of conduct and areas where there's a conflict of interest. They are in the remit of the Joint Standards Committee. So the Joint Standards Committee makes recommendations to full council. So they are going with the model code.
I fully appreciate that, Jane. I'm trying to be solution focused here and look at solutions to the problem we're facing. The problem we're facing is this is big and there's a lot of words for us to look at. And the other problem is that we've got to work at pace, as you say, because of the action plan. So what I'm saying is, would it be possible to prioritise the appendices and look at the constitution section and the priority appendices, which you started to list, which the priority ones were, first, as one chunk, and then second, the rest of the appendices as a chunk, and that they would go to full council in those two chunks, because we're dealing with some of the appendices separately at full council. Why is it impossible for us to do that when it is possible for other committees to do that? So I am trying to find solutions to the problem we find ourselves with. I'm not suggesting that we break up the articles, because I understand that they sit together. I'm suggesting that we just break this massive thing into two, and do the priority ones first that feed into the action plan, and then do the rest separately.
Right. I think we can labour this one to death. Is this a point in respect of Councillor Lomas's point, or is it separate? Fine.
The two parts of this, obviously, is with approving the new constitution, but then there's the adoption of the new constitution. Would it be possible for council to consider the constitution and approve the changes, but not adopt it until the whole procedure? So that, in other words, we approve the changes and then we bring it to a final council meeting when we've actually considered all the sections, and then adopt the constitution as one whole, which takes away the problem of you having to interpret a hybrid constitution. Would that be legally acceptable? Would that sort your problem?
Hold that thought. Councillor Webb, do you have a point relevant to this?
It depends on Jenny's answer to that, so I'm going to be...
Right.
The Audit and Governance Committee can use one meeting and say, we've signed off effectively X, Y, and Z, but we delay the reference to full council.
Yeah.
At the second meeting, you can sign off the rest of them, and then we do full council adopting the constitution in its entirety.
Yeah.
What I'm really loath to support is that full council is asked to adopt all of the articles and then not the appendices, because they're all cross-referenced and all interlinked, and the appendices by and large interpret how we intend to deliver the articles. That is the intention of it. So this committee can do approval in two stages, and then one adoption at full council in December, in January, whenever we can do that. Except the model code of conduct issues are on a different trajectory, because that is full council in October, and I'm required then to take back.
I think you've made that point repeatedly. Yeah,
I think the problem is that doesn't solve the problem of the action plan and the pace needed, Janie, which is what you started with, which is why you said we couldn't take our time over this, do it over several meetings and then send it to full council. What Councillor Fisher has just described is what Councillor Carr had suggested, and that Janie said couldn't happen because we need to do this at pace because of the action plan.
Because of the action plan.
So we've kind of gone around the houses a bit, but if that's now acceptable, that's fine.
In terms of this committee, you can take them at chunks and sign them off and say we're not going to revisit it. In terms of going to full council for adoption, that all has to go in one go, because I cannot give advice on two separate constitutions, because that will bring a lot of regulators down on my shoulders, and that is not good.
And Jamie, that's absolutely fine. I'm not.
Sorry.
That would have been really helpful to say at the beginning, but it doesn't solve the problem of us needing to do this quickly, then, does it?
Well, we can't do it quickly. I mean, the point I'm making is we cannot do this constitution quickly. It is going to take a number of meetings, potentially, well, 2 at least. If that has an impact on the PIR action plan being accepted, then so be it. I apologise if that makes life more inconvenient for you. But if the two things are so interlinked that they cannot be considered in separately or in isolation, then the Constitution, as you said right at the very beginning, at some stage in this meeting, has to trump everything else, and therefore we have to make sure that that's done correctly. I can't see any alternative, and it will have to take as long as it takes. Councillor Wan, you wanted to
yeah,
speak.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to get some clarification on when this does have to be done by, or when it would be best to have it done by, and then what else we could do to put more meetings in the diary in order to make sure this does happen. And it needn't just be us that's doing this work. We could look at who else might be doing this work. I think we also need to look at whether in order to get this approved, adopted.
Yeah, I think they're all really important questions. We've got the meeting scheduled for the 29th of September. We had, and that was one of the things that I wanted to discuss with you all this evening, whether we needed to look in the corporate calendar for an additional meeting at some time in October to consider the Constitution further. We then have the meeting of the 20th of October, which is a scheduled meeting. Now, nothing that we do on the 20th of October is going to go to full council on the 21st of October. So we therefore have at least until the December full council before this could conceivably be considered for the first time by full council. So we have the potential to schedule additional meetings, or if we don't want to look at meetings of additional meetings of A&G, and I suggest that we do, is the task and finish groups on a cross-party basis of members, not necessarily of this committee, but potentially co-opted into looking at this. And those would be my proposals, that we have another meeting, and I did take the advantage of speaking with Janie a few days ago about looking at additional meeting dates. And one of the ones that it's very difficult adding dates to the corporate calendar for, if you like, extraordinary committee meetings, because there's an expectation on officers, there's an expectation on webcasting, and there are complications. However, we did look at potentially the 6th of October as an additional meeting. Now that does clash with another committee, which is the Children's Scrutiny Committee, which would impact on Councillor Webb as the Vice Chair of that committee. However, my understanding is that Councillor Webb would be the only member of this committee that would be double booked, essentially. So if members are, Councillor Lomas, I was just going to make a proposal that we look at the 6th of October.
I just have a couple of questions.
Yes.
Jamie, can you remind us how far in advance this would have to be agreed before full council.
I need 7 days to publish the agenda for council.
Okay.
Sorry, I need 7 days to publish the agenda for full council.
So we have full council on the 16th of December. We also have a meeting of audit and governance on the 1st of December. So it's feasible then to say that that would be our sort of last meeting to discuss things relating to the constitution.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes, because the February meeting of full council is budget council.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't be able to take the constitution to budget council at all.
So it is that 1st of December, we would need to be sort of looking at the whole thing. Chair, I'm just going to observe that we're having a meeting tonight. We've got another meeting later this month. We have a meeting on the 20th of October. If we had a meeting on the 6th of October, that would be 4 meetings in the space of 2 months, which is quite a kind of intense schedule. I'm observing it just to say that is quite an intense schedule. Would it be better to have a meeting in the month of November in which there are no audit and governance meetings currently scheduled, rather than add an extra one into a month where there is?
November, you didn't come back to me with a date in November because it was.
November is the meeting of this committee in November.
It's not here on the.
No, it's not on this work plan, but I'm sure it's the 16th. It's on the corporate calendar, it's the 16th of November.
I thought we had a November meeting.
It's not on this work plan.
So, right, in that case, if we have got a November meeting, then I would suggest then that we don't use the 6th of October. Sorry, you didn't flag that up with me when we discussed it previously.
I was going off the work plan when we were discussing it, and I've been looking and just discovered that it's on it's Tuesday.
So it's just not Mike now.
Yeah, it's a Tuesday, 16th of November.
Right, fine.
Yeah.
Councillor Webb, then I'm going to draw this to a close.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. We've talked around about the houses about cross-party subcommittees for bits and pieces. Personally, something I think I find really, really useful. We will meet again on the 29th, where we could do something about this. But I think in the interim, it'd be really, really helpful from Janie to take this and chunk it up, right, into sections of interest, whatever those sections were. Preferably, I don't know, 7 of them might be quite nice because there's 7 of us. And then that we could be looking, if you can do that as soon as possible, we could, or however many chunks it works in, but it'd be really, really helpful to then, for us to say, okay, well, we could take a little subgroup of people and we could start to look at this independent of this process. And then we could then feed back into the meetings that we have between now and December the 1st. And I know that we've talked about having it as literally 2 sections, as 2 chunks, so to speak. But surely there must be within this bits that are relevant to the Lord morality, or bits that are relevant to finance. And if you could split it up, or at least give us indication of where those bits are, I think that will be a way to get through this. I think it's a bit of an elephant. Let's eat it one bite at a time.
Happy to have a go at whatever might work. However, you do need to build in time that I do somehow need to receive all the feedback in order to address the issues that are raised in this meeting. So, and I can't turn that around overnight from 7 separate subgroups.
But if those subgroups were meeting independent of these scheduled meetings, and then we came back to this scheduled meeting and fed back to you directly, we might speed up the process. Whereas anyway, that's my thought. But
I'm very happy to sit here and listen to your contributions, but I wouldn't be able, depending on the enormity of the contributions, to make changes However, there's a team of people involved in the constitution. So there's specialist commercial lawyers who help with the shareholder issues. There's other committees to consider as well. So I will absolutely try my best.
One thing that I would like you to do though is to canvass a cross-party working group of people who will be interested, because I think whatever feedback we give, it would make absolute sense that all 47 members, or a proportion of them that are interested in the constitution, have the opportunity to input into this. It would make no sense to me that we do all the work on it, and then it subsequently goes out at the very last minute, when people are left, when members essentially are left with a fait accompli that take it or leave it. So I'd much rather that process began as soon as possible. And if there is a way of developing a cross-party consensus on that, I think that would be the best case scenario. The other alternative is that groups or subgroups or small groups do their own thing and feedback. Whereas I think it's a constitution for all of us. So a cross-party group, I think, would be the best way forward. And I'll leave that with you to move on. So, if there aren't any other contributions, there are no other bits of urgent business, I'm now going to call this meeting to a close. Thank you. Good night.